Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament book of Psalms. We make it to Psalm 83 today, and if there's something about that number of Psalms 83, it's probably because you've heard people talk about it. Is it a psalm that is dedicated to prophecy, or is it something that was really kind of more contemporary to the time of its writing? And it is really kind of what it's referred to as imprecatory. And so it's that God would curse the enemies of Israel. So a lot of this depends on your view of eschatology and looking back at it as far as history is concerned. There are a lot of things that play into it, factoring in on why people hold one position or the other. And we'll go through both of them. And I want to be able to look at kind of what are the merits of both sides of it, and kind of try to take a look at it. It's really, honestly, it's something that really divides a lot of people as to whether they agree that this is actually something that was spoken more in the prophetic sense, and there's really even, I guess you could say, nuances to that as well, or if it's something that really has nothing to do with anything of modern times. And by modern times, since Israel is in focus here, it would have to be speaking about something that happened from 48 onward in our recent history, the last 100 years. So we're going to take a look at both sides of that and look at the text itself. We'll just kind of dedicate ourselves only to Psalm 83 today. And the second part of that is if it is speaking of something that's future, knowing that there is another future war that will be taking place and Israel will be the focus of it, that being Ezekiel. I want to do a little comparison on that, and we'll look at a map of just what is modern Israel and the Middle East, and I think that'll kind of help flesh this thing out a little bit. So what we'll do, let's turn to Psalm 83, and let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and let's take a look at the actual text itself and see if we can find where it is that there is the agreement, disagreement, and then let you decide as you see and seek the Lord on this, whether this is something that's spoken of prophetically or if it is something that is something that's already taken place. So let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as we come to your word that you give us the ability to read and to understand what your scripture would say. Any of us can read these things. What we want to make sure is that we understand what is the intent of the writer. What would you have us to know through this? And so as we come to Psalm 83, would you, by your Holy Spirit, open our eyes to what you would have us to know as we read this and as we learn your word. We give you all thanks and praise, and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, let me go out on and just say this right up front, that there are people, and you hear me say this from time to time, especially when it comes to places where there is really disagreement in the church. And there are people that I know and respect as brothers in the Lord and teachers and pastors who really disagree on whether or not this is something that really is kind of more relegated to history, or if it's something that still was future and spoken of in a prophetic sense. Let me address one of the things that we see in it, because Psalms is really kind of more considered as places where you would go to see things said maybe in a poetic sense or in the way of worship and thanksgiving and gratitude. There are a number of reasons why various Psalms are written. But it isn't as though there are no Psalms that don't have very much a future fulfillment from the time that they were written. How much the writer could have understood that they were speaking of future events. I think of the one that we see, I believe it's Psalm 110, where David is writing and he says, the Lord said to my Lord. And so it's the Melchizedek passage, and speaking about that he's being ordained as a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And so it's speaking clearly of Jesus. Now, how much he knows of that, or if you could travel back in a time machine and say, David, you're talking about Jesus, he would say, who? Of course, he would know that there would be one coming after him. By that time, he knows the prophecies and whatnot. The things that the people would be saying when Jesus came in at the triumphal entry about Hosanna, save now. That was, again, in a psalm, it is a prophetic proclamation saying the very words that people would be speaking as Jesus comes in that last time at Passover as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So it isn't as though there's not precedent, and there's plenty of others, that speak of the Messiah, and it's very, very clear that it's being spoken of events that would happen down the road. Once again, God's using the people writing at the time, mostly David, about events that really wouldn't have a fulfillment until later times in the person of Jesus. So you can find examples of Psalms being written, and you could make a kind of a contemporary way of looking at those particular Psalms and say there's a fulfillment there, but it leaves open the option and the potential for a future fulfillment as well. And that's what we'll kind of look at today. So important that we look at that, and what I'm going to do so that you can kind of screenshot these things, and that's it's kind of an important thing that you're able to do, going back and taking a look at particular things that we'll have up on the screen. Let me put the first one of them up now, and it is looking at what is the modern Middle East. And it's important when it comes to us in our understanding of the world in which it is now, because we're going to compare it to some older maps. And I'm going to put these up at the front so that you can screenshot these. I may put them up later. We'll just see what I think as I go through to do the editing on this. But this, right, what you're looking at is clearly a map of the Middle East as we understand it currently. And then if you have that, and I don't know if it's something you can put up on your screen, but like I say, if you screenshot these things, it's helpful because you can compare them up, or you can just pause the video and just go back and forth between these. But what you find in this one would be the ones mentioned as we'll get to those verses. I believe it starts at verse 6, where it begins to name the nations or the people that the writer here, it's attributed to Asaph. Once again, we don't know for sure which period of time. Is it literally Asaph, or is it one of the descendants? But it describes the nations that are mentioned. And so this is why it's really good for us to look kind of side by side on this. And we understand what nations are spoken of in the ancient and then in the modern. So what you're looking at now, again, is the nations that are mentioned as far as Psalm 83 is concerned. So if you do that overlay, you realize that what we're talking about is basically Lebanon. And if I'm looking at it like clockwise, you're looking at it from Lebanon down to Syria. In behind them to the east would be Iraq. To their south would then be Jordan. And then below that would be Egypt. But there are more that are mentioned. And so you get the Ishmaelites that are mentioned, the Hagarites that are mentioned. And what I want to make sure that we really understand here, it's not border states like we're thinking of. You're talking about really kind of more, you're looking more at the geographical areas. And so again, there's no border states at the time. It's just people come from a particular part of the world. But when we overlay it with a modern understanding, then we can see what it would be as far as we're concerned. If it was a future war, it would really help us in our understanding when we know the geographical areas of the groups. One of them is that's going to be mentioned is the Amalekites. And the Amalekites weren't as far down as Egypt, though they bordered with it. It's more in the southern part of what is Israel in the modern terms. It's the stuff that's kind of at Beersheba and a little bit below. And though it was the area that God had given to them, well within the borders of what God had promised through Genesis 15, still, when it comes to what was actually inhabited, when you look at the allotment to the 12 tribes, you really at Judah, and then within Judah of Simeon, you start to realize that Israel really didn't go that far into the south, all the way down to what is known to us as the Red Sea, or the Gulf of Aqaba, rather. None of that stuff was really much in the way of occupied by Israel. And so, yeah, you would have them during Solomon's time all the way down to Eilat, which is in the Gulf, it meets up at the Gulf of Aqaba, right down there at the very, very corner tip of Israel. And you could go look at maps of that as well. I don't want to get too far away from where we want to be going. But anyhow, as you look at that last map, the one thing I want to make sure that we are also not running one thing into another when it comes to the potential of being prophetic. This is the map of the Ezekiel 38 and that coalition that will end up coming against Israel. That is still future, and I don't think there's really much in the way of, if people believe that there is prophecy in the Old Testament and the New about future events, if you don't relegate everything to being historical, like amillennialists would do, or the people that look at the book of Revelation as though it's already all done and is already just kind of relegated to history, we look at the coalition of these nations. Never in world history has that group of people come against Israel as a coalesced group of nations. There's never been a time when they do. And so you get a look at this, and what's interesting is the Psalm 83 participants, for the most part, are what's mentioned in Psalm 83. Even if you don't believe for a moment that there is any kind of a future Psalm 83 fulfillment from the time that it was written, then you do notice by they're kind of conspicuous by their absence, because Egypt and Syria and Jordan and Lebanon are really not part of the coalition that Ezekiel looks at. You're looking at much more of Eastern Europe and of Turkey and of all of the Baltic states and the things to the south of Russia, and Russia being a part of it, and then of course all the like Persia, so that part of Iran, and what is northern Africa with the exception of Egypt. So very, very interesting that these are, again, two passages where you have groups of people that are mentioned. And the Ezekiel one, there's really not a whole lot of debate if we believe about wars being spoken of. Ezekiel simply doesn't have any kind of historical precedent for it. When you go in, and if you were to go watch online of other Bible studies of Psalm 83, you will notice that there are those who will say that there is a historical precedent for a fulfillment of the Psalm 83 war, and they'll give you some kind of explanation that it's happened in times past, and they can look at historical things. There still does seem to be some bit of wanting as far as the actual fulfillment of it, and that it would have been literally fulfilled in times past, because there just doesn't have a historical time when all of the nations that are mentioned in Psalm 83 have ever come against Israel at once. And in the language of Psalm 83, it gives the impression that they, like the group that comes against them in Ezekiel 38, once again, there just has never been a time when either of the groups have really as one come against Israel. So that really does give the impression that it is something that we can look at as being something future. So to get back into our text, let's go ahead and take a look at verse 1, and we'll read up through verse 6. So if it's imprecatory, if it's calling for a curse, in verse 1, what you have is just kind of the request. It's, God, will you take note of the things that have taken place? So here's what it says. Do not keep silent, O God, and do not hold your peace, and do not be still. And so it's not a demand. Of course, anybody with their understanding of how God does what he does realizes you don't make demands of him. This is more of an ask. It's more of a request. It's formulated in kind of a way of a prayer, and it's a petition, a supplication. Father God, will you do this? And so it is, first of all, for him to take note. And then the action comes from verses 2 to 5. It says this, for behold, your enemies, they make a tumult. And a tumult is just a noise. It's a disturbance. It's like the crashing of a wave. And so there's a real noisy thing that is taking place, and this group of people are doing these things. There are going to be some other things said about them. So it says, now they have taken crafty counsel against your people. And crafty is just, it's a shrewd, it's kind of a conspiracy. They have joined together as one group. They're of one mind in this. And he's going to say that in the language itself gives that impression. So again, as we have with the Ezekiel passage, if we want to look at all of the people mentioned, is there a time when they've all come against Israel all at one time? And the only way that people have ever been able to make a case for it that I've seen is that they might say it's when it's not that they were individual nations, but rather than when they were more proxies of another nation, like in this case Assyria, or any of the subsequent ones that Asaph could have been writing about. But Asaph, unless there's a late writing where it's like the ones that we've been studying before this, there are some of the Psalms that are attributed to Asaph that are clearly looking at a time when the fall of Jerusalem has already taken place. It's clearly much, much later, well beyond the original Asaph of David's time. It's actually talking about when the kingdoms have failed and they've gone through the Babylonian captivity. The north is long since gone, wiped out by the Assyrians. So if that was the case, and you're doing a much, much later view of it, you could say, well, the person that's writing is considering maybe Babylon or even Persia as the nation that had come against Israel with its proxies. Persia doesn't work very, very well. And actually the one that would work in that scenario, and hopefully I'm making this clear, is maybe Babylon, because it was, again, the world power. And these would be, maybe they try to make the case, be their proxies or their vassals. These are just provinces of a greater power. So if that makes sense, hopefully it does. If it doesn't, then let me know in the comments section at YouTube or send me an email. I'll be happy to go ahead and work through it with you a little bit further. So anyhow, there are a lot of ways that this is looked at by various people. But once again, if we're going to take it and we want to understand it, the person writing this is describing nations with real specifics. And it is that they have consulted together. So that's what we get there in that third verse where it says, they have taken crafty counsel against your people, and they have consulted together against your sheltered ones. And now again, that's speaking of Israel. So it is something that this group of people that's mentioned, they have all come to a one mind, one heart on how they want to approach this attack, which really means it really leaves some lacking in the language that this could have been, well, this nation did this at one point, that nation did it at another, this nation down here, they came against Israel, looking at that second map that we had put up. And it doesn't mean that they've all come at one time. Well, the language seems to give the impression that it is a concerted effort between all of them, and they have all had a hand in coming against Israel in this case. So, we see in verse 4, it says, they have said, now come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. Now that's very reminiscent of the kind of rhetoric that we hear from the Islamic world, especially Iran, in our modern day. But once again, the idea that they would be removed, we're hearing those chants in the streets of our country. If you're listening to me from the United States, I'm recording this on New Year's Day, and just last night, before the festivities there in Times Square, there was a huge march in New York by pro-Palestinian, quote unquote. Ultimately, they're pro-Hamas. Let's just be honest. That's who runs the area that's being targeted by Israel currently. And they were doing, again, their whole thing, from the land to the sea, Palestine will be free. Of course, it'll never take place, but really think about what they're talking about is the eradication of the nation of Israel in order for that to be the case. So they should just be, the powers that be and those who report and the politicians and everything else ought to be honest about what's being said and what's ultimately being promoted. So it's an interesting thing that we see taking place in front of us now. But again, there's a conspiracy among these people that are being mentioned, and that conspiracy is, let's take the land and let's remove God's people from it, whether they would want to admit that or not verbally, whether they even understand it. That's ultimately the intended outcome of this. And that is something that has been taking place as long as any of us can remember, that there are those who want to see Israel destroyed absolutely and completely. And so you can go back all the way from pretty much the inception of everything. When you think about Abraham and the promises given to him, at that point, when we talk Abraham, we're talking 4,000 years. The attempt to eradicate the Jews has been something that has been taking place since the Exodus, and it's happened multiple times throughout history, more so than any other nation that's ever existed. people that have been targeted for extermination. There's never been anyone like Israel when it comes to that. And of course, that's because it's a covenant nation that God has made a covenant with. And there's only a spiritual explanation as to why they get singled out the way that they do for some of the most barbarous kinds of attacks and some of the just genuine hatred of a people. And the people who hate them, a lot of times when they're asked, they don't even know why. They just hate them. So again, only a spiritual explanation really helps to understand why that is the way that it is. So it says in verse 4, so they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. And so that's the ultimate goal that they have here stated. That's the desire that they have. So it says in verse 5, for they have consulted together with one consent. They're of one mind, one heart. This is our intended work that we want to do here. They have formed a confederacy against you. So it is that it's that language that just leads me to believe that it's hard to say, well, when that group up there came against Israel or this group or whatever else, most of the ones that you find mentioned here that they would have warred against from the time of David would be Edom and Moab, the Amalekites, all of those groups there. So what we would think of as modern day Jordan and all the way down into Egypt and what is really today in the southern portion, very sparsely inhabited of what is modern day Israel. So when you look at those maps, you kind of get an idea which ones we're talking about. There were, of course, the problems with the Philistines along the Mediterranean coast there. As you look, that's where Gaza is currently that we have that. But the 5 cities are outside of what is modern Gaza. And you had Gaza City, of course, but above that you have Ashkelon and Ashdod, and you have Gath and Ekron that are more towards, as you're moving towards the east, but still along the coastal portion of the country. So that would have been the Philistines. That's where they lived. The Egyptians were, again, a problem that we know about. And so, again, all involved in Psalm 83. Go back and look at the maps. I put them up there for you. And so it kind of helps to understand who's being spoken of here. Now, if you have that map pulled up, and actually this would probably be a good time for me to just, you know what I'll do? I'll put that map back up of the Psalm 83 participants, and this will maybe be a little bit helpful for us to look through it again. Let me read through the names. It says, for the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, so this is towards the east of the Jordan River. Now you'll notice that there is a color on the east of the Jordan River that's the same color as what is Israel, and that's because this map reflects the allotment of the tribes. And on that part that is on the east of the Jordan River that's the same color as Israel is where you had Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh had settled there, and that's where you have the Ammonites on the to the east of there. So modern day Jordan. And so it says also the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagarites, and that's Hagar as far as what we're thinking about Isaac and Ishmael. It was Hagar who was the mother of Ishmael. So that was Hagar, if you remember that whole thing. That's what's really, to this day, that's still an issue. The people to whom the land was promised, I just did a study on this not too long ago. Whose land is it anyway? And that's because it follows, if you look through Genesis 17, it follows the family line down from Abraham through Isaac. God says it with specifics. It is not Ishmael. It is not the son of Hagar. It is the son of Sarah. And so God's the one who said it. Even when Abraham said, well, let Ishmael be the one who stands before you or walks before you. And God says, no, without any, details, just no, straight up, no, period, exclamation point. It will be Isaac. And so that's really not an issue. So who has the rights to the land? Well, God has the rights to the land, and he's the one who said who he will give it to. It's the son of Abraham, but it is through Isaac and not through Ishmael. He makes that in no uncertain terms. So by doing so, it's Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, Jacob to his 12 sons, the tribes of Israel, the ones who come out of the Exodus and then come into the land. And for the first time, they take possession of what God had given to them after hundreds of years of promise. So really a wonderful study. If you're not familiar with it, let me know, and I can put up some links to studies that we've done on this. Very, very easy to track down. It's not very difficult to understand. So we see in verse 7, Gebal, and Gebal is actually kind of up in the part of Lebanon. So it's kind of detached. When you look at Ammon and Amalek, or the Amalekites, they're spoken of. That's to the Amalekites, or to the southern portion of Israel. And when you look at the Ammon, that is modern day. When you see Amman, Jordan, we're talking about like the heart of modern day Jordan. But Gebal is up on the Mediterranean coast in what is modern day Lebanon. And then, of course, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. So that is the coastal people that have come against Israel at times. Philistia is, of course, where the Philistines were, and then up in the north, again, Tyre, that's mentioned as well. And during David's time and during Asaph's time, there was good relations between Tyre and Tyre and that whole part. In fact, they were the ones who supplied the cedars for Solomon to build the temple. So this gives the impression that this is written sometime after the fact, because it was very normalized and they had good relations with the king of Tyre. So it says also Assyria has also joined them, and they have helped the children of Lot. And the children of Lot are already mentioned. So we think of modern day Jordan. That's where Lot went when he split, and Abraham went his direction, Lot went his direction towards the east. And again, that's all the modern day, everything to the east that there is of Israel. Assyria is interesting because it is up in the north on the opposite, or towards the very much northeastern portion of modern day Syria, all the way into where is Iraq and all of those areas. So Assyria is the major player in that part of the world before Babylon. And so again, just historically, they're the ones that were responsible for the disillusionment of the tribes in the north, and they would have taken the south as well. They would have destroyed it had it not been for the ministry, if you will, of Isaiah and of Hezekiah, and how they came before the Lord, and the Lord defeated Assyria on their behalf. So these are the nations that are mentioned. Again, those maps, I think, prove very much helpful for us to understand who's being spoken of. So back to the part of where the prayer is. And this is pretty interesting stuff. So when it says in verse 9, deal with them as with Midian, and also as with Sisera, with Jabin at the brook Kishon, who perished at Endor, and who became a refuse on the earth. Make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeeb, and yes, their princes like Zeba and Zalmunna. So this is looking back, and so when the person who is praying for this is asking the Lord to give them this victory and do the things, it's looking back at times when God has done miraculous great things. Now, the two things that are mentioned here when it comes to Midian, and there's a jump in it. It starts with what we would think of as Gideon, and what Gideon had done with his defeat of the Midianites. And so that's Judges chapters 6 and 7. That's where it starts. The next thing it does refers back to Judges chapter 4, and that was the time of Deborah and the prophetess, not prophetess, but one of the judges rather, in the book of Judges, Deborah, and the fight that she had with Sisera, and Barak is mentioned in that as one of the people who fought. But this is all in the Jezreel Valley that's being spoken of here. We'll get to those locations here in just a little bit. But then it skips back to the mention of these four people that are mentioned. They're the princes and the kings that were ultimately defeated at the hands of Gideon when God rose up to do this. So what you have, the writer here of this psalm says, as you have done in the past, so we are asking that you will do so also in the future. So this defeat of these people. I want to go back and before we go on any further and start to look at the defeat of these nations, the ones that are mentioned, Midian, and then of course the army of Sisera, would have been kind of to the northern parts of Israel, doesn't, in those two examples, doesn't even begin to cover the coalition of nations that will come against Israel. So let's deal with very quickly before we start to look at what is the prayer of that he would defeat them like he's defeated enemies in the past. If you take the view that all of this is really kind of relegated to the past, that God has actually done as was requested, and the nations that had come against Israel, where are they now? They're other nations now. They're known by other names, and they don't have the same kind of concerns. And but yet you can find Israel has been displaced from the land for a very long time, but they're back in the land, the same land of their fathers, and for the generations, for thousands of years. The children of Abraham the children of Israel have lived there. The children of Jacob, the tribes, they have lived in that land. God said he would displace them, but he also said that he would bring them back. And so there they are in the land, just as God has promised before. But those other nations have all kinds of varying interests and various things that are taking place in their countries. A lot of unrest in that part of the world, even among Israel's enemies, because they're always fighting for some kind of territory. And there's the divisions within Islam between Sunnis and Shiites and other little offshoots and various radical groups. But what you have in Israel, though there is a lot of political intrigue going on there, a lot between the religious and the secular, yet the people there are descendant from Abraham. They have a common language that has been spoken there for thousands of years. They have a belief system for the ones who are devout. They have a belief system that goes back to the law, and they have picked up where they left off, if you will, from their displacement at the hands of the Romans until the middle of last century. So with all that being said, the thing that's very intriguing when you take a look at this group, and I think it's probably a good idea to bring that map up again. And so this is that one for Psalm 78, or Psalm 83 rather. Looking at the nations that are mentioned here, if you go back and take a look, and if I'm going to try to make the case that this was future and that it had a prophetic fulfillment that was to be taking place, what I can look at in modern history was the battles that you had of 48 and of 67 and of 73. If you look at the wars and go back and do your homework on it as you're looking at this map, in Psalm 48, you had, in 1948, Psalm 83, the nations that would have come against them fit this narrative really, really well. And so we think of Israel in its infancy, and even as it is in modern day, the people who came against them, once again, clockwise, just like Psalm 83, this is the coalition of 1948 that came against Israel when it was just fighting for its independence. So you had Lebanon, you had Jordan, you had Syria, you had Egypt, and you had also the nation of Iraq. And that's who came against them. That was miraculously won by Israel, and they actually extended some bit of what the land allotted to them was. The Arabs refused to allow Israel to become a nation and wanted to go to war over it. Israel went to war. They didn't ask for it, but God gave them incredible victory, and they gained land in it. Happened again in 1967. Basically the same participants all came against them, what was known as the Six-Day War. And this was something that just, again, miraculously, the same group of people came against Israel once again. And in that case, in 67, Israel took back Jerusalem, and they took back pretty much all of the land all the way to the Jordan. And they, for peace sake, tried to give back bits and pieces of the West Bank and give them the ability to do the foreign nations to have some amount of autonomy. Yet Israel is able to kind of control that. Same thing with Gaza, the Golan Heights, that was all taken in 67. But it's that same group of countries. It was Lebanon, it was Jordan, it was Syria, it was Egypt. And there was the assistance also in some of these other wars. You had people coming from other countries. Saudi Arabia had bits and pieces of it. Iraq, again, was involved in this. And so as the writer of Psalm 83, they're not looking, once again, like I said, at kind of borders and nation states. They're looking more at geographical areas. So it helps us in our understanding of who was coming against them. So if we think about the Amalekites, that is again everything that you would see down towards the south, and that was very fierce fighting in especially in 67 and in 73 down in the south that is there. So Egypt would be seen as extended up into the area of where the Amalekites were. They clearly are not in any recent times referred to as Amalekites, but you would see that Egypt could easily cover a good portion of what was their former territory in those wars. The last of the wars in 73, which was the Yom Kippur War, that was really kind of more, once again, Syria and Egypt that were involved. And to some extent, you had the other ones, the same groups of countries, but they were not the main protagonists. It was almost entirely Egypt and Syria as far as the nations, but people came and got to be a part of it as far away as Cuba and North Korea, if you can imagine that. They had committed people and resources to it, as did Saudi Arabia and other of the nations. So once again, if you're trying to look at Psalm 83 and say, is there any future fulfillment that really does work with the nations that are mentioned? And again, if we're going to think about the Philistia or the Philistines or Gaza, well, we clearly know that would be a part of Egypt. Again, in 67, that was a part of Egypt, and it was taken by Israel, and so that just is part of Egypt's coalition. That might even be seen as somewhat of the Amalekites' territory as well. It's almost an overlapping. So anyway, you can look at it right there and just say, yeah, you can make the case that whether you want to say 48, 67, 73, or all of the above, it's just a kind of a protracted engagement from the time of 48 up through 73. And there really still is that same belligerence today, though they've never tried to make war against Israel in the same way. People recently, when the things happened on October the 7th, have looked at this and said, well, Gaza rose up under Hamas, but what you don't find is the other nations in the same way of really kind of trying to come against them. You've had some limited things that have happened coming out of Syria, some things coming out of Lebanon, and little dust-ups in the West Bank, which we would consider as a former portion of Jordan, but nothing like what you saw in 48, 67, or 73. So what we're watching take place in Gaza right now, if all of a sudden you started to have an advancement coming out of the north from Hezbollah, and if you actually had Syria starting to move and Jordan starting to move, and again Egypt coming up from the south, now you're talking about the same participants in Psalm 83, but that's not happening currently. So what I think is happening currently is not a fulfillment of Psalm 83, but what's happening currently in Israel could very well be the trigger for Ezekiel 38. I'm curious to watch what happens with Russia as it has its hands full with Ukraine, but now there's all kinds of talk about trying to come up with some kind of a resolution and a ceasefire, and let's just give some land to Russia to make them go away. If that's the case, that really frees up Russia to do a lot more than they have currently, than they currently could do, because they're so committed, manpower and resources, to what's going on in Ukraine. But if they can get out of that, it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. So let me just put a nice little neat bow on this and we'll finish out the text. I don't really see Psalm 83 in our current configuration of nations. I don't really think in the time that we have that you'll find a coalition that will come together once again that would include modern day Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and also Jordan, maybe even down into Saudi Arabia, which is that where you get into the Ishmaelites and the Hagarites. They went that far. So if it would come to that, for all those nations to come together based on what we're seeing taking place in Israel, it's going to be a really interesting thing how that happens, and then all the nations that will ultimately come against Israel in the Magog, the war of Gog and Magog. I do find it interesting, though, that there is no real crossover of the nations that are mentioned in Psalm 83 versus the ones that are mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39, because they're absolutely different geographical areas and different groups of people that come from different areas in those two wars. So if both of them are going to have to take place future, as some would hold, they will be two separate wars. It will be an absolute dismantling of the surrounding nations from Psalm 83, because they're not going to be involved in Ezekiel 38. So why that is, maybe they've had enough. They don't have a lot of ability to do a whole lot. Syria is really hamstrung. Lebanon could put the people in from Hezbollah. That's who is doing anything that there is being done out of Lebanon is coming from them. Again, a proxy of Iran and a terrorist group like you have done in with Hamas in Gaza. But again, is Jordan in any kind of a position? Is Egypt in any kind of a position to make a move against Israel? Probably not. And the ones that will come out of the northern part of Africa are really not world powers. And in the 73 war, the whole northern part of Africa joined in and helped with manpower, but they weren't really mobilizing armies, just manpower. They sent troops, but they weren't really the main drivers of that war. So once again, in Ezekiel, you have activated the whole northern part of Africa except for Egypt. And you have much of the Muslim world will come against Israel, though not Saudi Arabia, not Iraq, but you certainly have Persia, and then most of what is north of Israel in that part of the Islamic countries of Eastern Europe, and then of the southern stands, and down into Iran of modern day. Turkey, of course, being a main player in this as well. So again, I know I went through all that really, really fast. If you have any questions, please follow up with me through the email. But I want to deal with what we see here in Psalm 83. So let me recap real quick before we get to the final verses of this. The writing of this begins with the writer saying, God, would you perk up your ears and see what's taking place here. And notice that this group and these nations have come together, and they're of one mind and one heart. What they want to see is the removal of your people, and they want to take over its land. Then those nations are identified. And so what ends up happening from them, the person making the prayer, and I don't have any problems believing this is said as a prayer. Whether it is a prayer and the person praying it didn't realize that there could also be a future fulfillment even to our days, and of the formation of the nation of Israel and the coalition that tried to destroy it again in 48, 67, and 73, I believe you can make the case for both things being true, and it doesn't have to be an either or. The people that would say Psalm 83 is only an imprecatory prayer and it's all history. The people that were saying, no, it's only speaking about future wars that they think are even future to this time, I would say I take kind of a view that there is the prayer that was very much focused on those nations at that time, but really leaving the door wide open for what would happen when Israel would become a land again, and the nations that would come against it. They fit better than any historical precedent that I've been able to look at through history and make application to it. So I don't have the either or view. It's old and it's already done. There's nothing future to it, versus the people that would say, no, it was spoken of prophetically. And some people say it still has future fulfillment. Others say it really was the foundation of the country in the three wars between 48 and 73. I fit more in the category of thinking it's speaking about the nation of Israel and those who have come against it in the times previous up through 73, and that it also was the prayer that God would have retaliation and retribution against the nations that had looked to destroy Israel, just as he had done through Deborah and Barak against Sisera and the king who sent him as well. That's who's mentioned here, and that is again in the Jezreel Valley. So if you're taking a look, and just go ahead and take a look at the Jezreel Valley from Mount Carmel. And let me go ahead and, you know what, I should just go ahead and put that one up here too. Let me put up a picture of that, because you can kind of get an idea where the things are located in that valley. So if you take a look at this picture here, this is from Mount Carmel in Israel, and you're looking at the Jezreel Valley. The orientation is looking towards the southeast. And so on the right-hand side of that frame, that's where Megiddo would be out in the valley. Towards the left, you're seeing Nazareth, and that mountain in the back, that's Mount Tabor. And so that's the place where Sisera died because he tried to escape into the tent of a woman named Yael. and she put a tent stake through the guy's head. Pretty pretty gruesome stuff, but that's what God did. He defeated the enemies there. Or if it was the Midianites just creating all the havoc that they did, God raises up Gideon and the 300 men with him, and he does this miraculous thing also there in the Jezreel Valley. That happened there as well. And so that's the book of Judges, chapter 4 for the Deborah and Barak, chapter 6 and 7 for Gideon. And so the writer here is speaking about times past when God has come to the aid of Israel in miraculous ways. And so he's asking that God would do those things again. So he says about those people that say, let's take for ourselves the pastures of God as a possession, verses 11 and 12. In verse 13, he says, oh my God, would you make them like the whirling dust and like the chaff before the wind? The imagery here is pretty self-explanatory. As you will see on a windy day, that dust gets kicked up or it gets into those whirlwinds, or as they would understand, when you're separating wheat from chaff, you get onto a little bit of a higher elevation and you throw the wheat up into the air. It's heavy enough to fall back down. The breeze will take the chaff away with it. So the chaff before the wind in verse 14. Now see, just to make sure, he's using imagery that they understand. So he's saying, would you put these people to flight and would you stir them up and remove them like you will do with the dust in a windstorm, or like wheat being separated from chaff? Same kind of things. This imagery is obvious to them. As the fire burns the woods and as the flame sets the mountains on fire, so pursue them with your tempest and frighten them with your storm. Again, imagery that's very easy to understand. When there's a raging fire, then people are going to flee from it rather than to be burned up. And so he throws in the second element to this whole thing, that in the same way that a fire drives out, it consumes everything and it drives out the people that can be driven out, so may it be the same way, as you see in verse 16, pursuing them with your tempest and then cause fear or frighten them with your storm. Let them come to the place of being terrified at who you are. Now, as we're going to see in the next verse, the whole intention of this is twofold. That you would defeat the enemies in the hopes that some of them may even come to their senses. And before I read verse 16, I will tell you, as I'm praying now, though I don't believe what's taking place in Israel is Psalm 83, a lot of other things would have to happen and nations would have to join the struggle and the fight against Israel alongside Hamas and Hezbollah in the north in order for that to even begin to work here. But again, people will agree or disagree with me on this. That's fine. Again, very credible people that I respect greatly have different views on this, so that's fine. But as far as this is concerned, the way that I'm praying for this, God, would you give exactly what is here? Would you drive out those people who look to do your people harm, Hamas, Hezbollah, any of the people that are doing the stuff out of Syria or in the West Bank, what we would call Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, and the rest of that whole bunch of terrorists. When it comes to that, God, I pray that you would drive those people out. But I also pray at the same time that what you do is so obvious to the people who look that they don't want to contest with you any longer. They don't want to fight this fight. They become disillusioned, discouraged, defeated, and in that whole thing that they would give up their arms, but at the same time that they would realize the only reason that they have to is because God has intervened, that they would come to know him. And that's what's said here in verse 16. Fill their faces with shame, and that is being disgraced by what they did. Because remember, they said, we want to go and take their land. We want to wipe them off and make it where they're gone and remove them and just defeat them, kill them. So it says, fill their faces with shame, have them just, when you look at them, they're destroyed in their countenance, in their will, in their resolve. They're completely disgraced and dysfunctional at that point. Fill their faces with shame, they are so that they may seek your name, O Lord. What a wonderful possibility that would be. Let them, because of their hubris and their pride, thinking that they could overthrow your people, let them realize what an utter failure they've been and that they might turn to you. So, let them be confounded and let them be dismayed. The confounded is, again, it's just to be frustrated and disappointed. So let them be confounded and dismayed forever. It's in the eternal sense. Yes, and let them be put to shame, and then, of course, to perish and to be put to death. If, and that again, the qualifier here, remember he's already said that they might come to know you. This is that if they don't, let them then become dismayed. Let them be anxious and do things hastily. Let them make mistakes and do things. Which, as I look at this now, if we do look at the modern things and how I am praying about this, though I don't think it's Psalm 83, at the same point, you want them to be completely confused and confounded, like God has done so many times before. The people make that want to wipe out Israel, they make their plans, and yet they fail. They become confused and they start to turn on one another. This is what I would love to see take place. But again, in all of that confusion, I would pray that they would see that their God has failed them miserably, and that the God of Israel has done great things, miraculous even so. And then verse 18, as it says here, that they may know you, whose name is above, or whose name alone is the Lord. Or this would be where we get Yahweh or Jehovah. Okay, that's where we would get God Almighty. And then the second part of this, that you are God, that you are most high, or Elyon, that you are most high over all of the earth. And this is the hope. This is the desired outcome that they would want to see take place. So, again, just to kind of finish this whole thing out, when I look at the nations that are mentioned there, I do find it incredibly curious when you do the side-by-side on this of what was considered the times of the writing of this and where those nations were that are mentioned by name, and put them on a map. And then take a look at the modern world the same way. You find that these are the protagonists. These are the people who had looked to go to war and to eradicate Israel before it could become a nation or really become firmly planted. These are the same nations in all three of those attempts to destroy Israel. Some of them are more prominent. Egypt and Syria are the ones who were consistently the leading people. Jordan kind of dropped out of that, as did Lebanon for the 73 war, though they didn't have any problems putting some resources in, but they didn't mobilize as a nation like Syria and like Egypt, especially Egypt. Egypt was, my goodness, when you go back and study the 73 war and the things that Ariel Sharon did, and the victory that God gave to them against Egypt, my goodness, they could have wiped out Egypt in this, which miraculous in just amazing ways. Anyhow, I look at the people that are mentioned in this ancient text, the time of Asaph, whether it's 3,000 years ago, whether it's, more like 2,600 years ago, whatever the case may be, it is at very, very minimum, it is incredibly coincidental when you look at the nations mentioned here in Psalm 83 as opposed to the ones who have come against Israel since its inception in modern times. Again, 48, 67, 73. I'd love to get your feedback on this. If you have any questions about any of what I've shared in this, then please contact me by email. I'd love to be able to go over this with you. And if you're listening to this, once again, and you've made it all the way to the end, hopefully you have, we also have a trip that we are taking to Israel, which we would love to invite you to come along with us if you'd like. And we have every intention of getting there in April, thinking that much of what we see here, though they say it could take months to completely subdue everything, the ability of Hamas to do the things that they have done up to this day are so badly diminished that I don't feel in any way unsafe. I'd be going, personally, I would go by myself tomorrow if I could. But up in the north, that again, the more that things are suppressed in the south, the less things will be happening in the north. And I would think that things will be pretty close to normal by the time we go in April. But again, if there's a problem with it, if there's any security issues and it's unsafe, we would postpone the trip till a later time when it was okay to travel. So I have details on that if you have any interest in that. But for this, we'll conclude Psalm 83 today, and we'll pick up at Psalm 84 next week. And you can join us also on our Thursday Bible studies as we have just completed the book of 2 Peter, and we move on to 1 John chapter 1. We'll be doing that this coming Thursday. I pray that you have had a safe New Year's Eve and look forward to what God will do in 2024. It is going to be a very interesting year for so many reasons. So we will pick up at Psalm 84 next week.